Buenas noches y bienvenidos una vez más a esta Maco Expo Online 2026. Muchas gracias a todos los que se han mantenido esta semana dando cita en este estanque de conocimiento donde queremos llevar a un poco de sabiduría, de viñetas, de globos y de buenas historias. Mi nombre es Leonardo Ricardo de la parte de la Maco Expo y Moro Estudio. Para mí es un honor estar aquí con alguien que tuve el placer de conocer, tomar algunas clases y poder, y me dio la oportunidad también de dar algunas opiniones y algunas clases allá en un instituto que espero algún día seguir trayendo los lazos. Se trata de Instituto de Arte y Diseños de Minneapolis, la MCAD. Él es profesor en la carrera de cómics. Así de chicos, algún día estamos trabajando en eso. Haremos una carrera de cómic aquí en el país, pero mientras tanto, tengo el honor de presentar a Robert Algeo from NCAD. So let's give a warm digital claps to here to welcome him home. Él va a estar compartiendo la charla de hoy sobre aprendiendo con cómics, ¿verdad? Cómics y enseñanza. La charla va a ser en inglés, pero las preguntas y respuestas las pueden poner abajo o en los comentarios o en la cajita de preguntas y respuestas. Recuerden que todo esto se va a subir de nuevo al YouTube de la Maco Expo luego de la charla con subtítulos. Los que puedan escribir en inglés pueden hacerlo en español, no se preocupen. Y Robert va a dar algunas recomendaciones. Eso lo pueden anotar, yo también lo voy a anotar para compartir en los grupos. Pero recuerden que la charla va a ser en inglés primero. Y luego las preguntas y respuestas pueden ser en español o en inglés, no se preocupen. Cuando subamos la charla va a estar con subtítulos, así que no se preocupen. So, once again, let's take it away. Here was Robert Algeo and a digital clap for him. So, Robert, take it away.
Thanks, Lurian. It's great to be here with everyone this evening. Like Lurian said, my name is Robert Algeo. I'm a professor of comics at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and I'm really excited to be here speaking with all of you. When Lurian reached out to me about talking to all of you tonight, he sort of shared an idea about maybe talking a little bit about books that I like to use when I'm thinking about making and thinking about teaching comics. And so I've picked a few to talk about tonight, and I hope that you'll find our time together useful and interesting and help you sort of understand comics in, if not an entirely new way, maybe a slightly deeper way than you're used to. Before I dig in, though, I do want to just say thank you, of course, to Leorian for always thinking of me and allow me to participate. I love speaking to folks about comics and evangelizing for the art form, and I know there's tons of really talented folks on the call this evening, and so it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with all of you. I also want to thank the folks at the Young Leaders of America Initiative, Global Minnesota, Leora and your other colleagues at Moro Studio and at the Maco Expo online. It's just a cool opportunity to be talking to all of you. So usually when I'm teaching, and we actually just started our new semester last week here in the Twin Cities. So I've been talking to new students all week, and they all have kind of the same question, which is, what books should I buy? What should I be looking at? What should I get my hands on when I'm thinking about making comics? And most of my students are looking for input in terms of maybe specific textbooks, sort of scholarly books that are written in a way that are offer like specific techniques or ideas, and are like useful in terms of teaching you how to make comics. However, I want to sort of talk a little bit about why I won't be talking about textbooks tonight. But for those of you in the room who are maybe interested in that kind of publication, I have a few that I'll mention here at the top, but then I want to actually pivot to some actual comics. So in terms of my own history, when I was very young, I think I got my first copy of this book when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And at least in America, this is a pretty well-known comic book called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema. And that book goes pretty in depth on like sort of conventions of superhero storytelling, ways to make your panels look really big and cool and dynamic. But as I got a little bit older, I became a little bit less interested in superhero stuff. I mean, I still love it as a reader, but the kinds of comics I wanted to make were maybe not quite like that. So then I discovered books like Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art. I discovered the books of Scott McCloud, probably most famously Understanding Comics and then Making Comics. Another book that I often use with my students is a book called Drawing Words and Writing Pictures by Jessica Abel and Matt Madden. There's tons of wonderful textbooks about lettering, including Nate Picos's comic book, The Essential Guide to Comic Book Lettering. Another book I discovered recently was called Manga in Theory and Practice by Harisho Araki, I believe is how you pronounce that. And then another great book I also discovered just a week ago is called The Proofreader's Guide to Comic Book Style. And so these are kind of, for me, sort of like classic foundational level textbooks about making comics. And textbooks can be great. And if you're interested in becoming a comic practitioner at any level of the field, writer, penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, I think starting with one of these books or a selection of these books would be a great place to begin your journey into learning about comics. However, the thing with textbooks is they focus almost exclusively on helping you make your comics. And what I mean by that is they focus almost exclusively on the tools and techniques that allow you to finish something that people would look at and understand is a comic. And so textbooks are very, very useful, but they aren't what I want to talk about, because what I want to talk to you about tonight is not necessarily how to make a comic. I want to talk to you about what readers need when they're reading your comics. And I want to look at some specific comics that do the things that I'm talking about, because it's very, very easy to get very, very good at making good looking comics that have exciting artwork, that are well produced and well made, but don't tell the stories very well. And while I love all of the books on this list, and of course these books talk about story and talk about clarity and talk about storytelling, a lot of the times these books focus on like the physical practice of making a comic. And I thought what might be a little bit more useful and a little bit more interesting was for us tonight to look at some comics, not books about comics, that do what I think are some important foundational level storytelling things. And my reason being there is my view is that it doesn't matter how well drawn your comic is, the story needs to be good. And so my hope too is that what I want to talk to you about tonight will apply to all of you, no matter what style of artwork you're making your comics in. And also, just to be blunt, no matter how good a drawer you are. Some of my favorite comics have some of the worst drawings I've ever seen, right? But because they tell the story clearly, I think that's really, really useful. And I think a lot of these kinds of books really focus on how can you make a good looking thing that looks like a comic. Whereas I'd like to talk in a little bit more detail about story and storytelling. So tonight there are sort of like three big ideas that I want to talk about. I want to be very clear that I don't claim to have invented these ideas, but I find that talking about these ideas in the way that I do is the easiest way for me to express an idea to my students when I'm working with them. And so hopefully you'll find some value in that as well. So the first thing I would like to talk about are the responsibilities that all of your comic book panels have to their neighbors, to their other comic book panels. And so I'm going to tell you what those responsibilities are. I'm going to show you an example of what I'm talking about, and then we'll look at a comic that I think does that really well. So my view is that when you're making a comic, no matter how many panels or pages or drawings or images you have in your comic, there's three things that every panel needs to try to do. And the first thing every panel needs to do is it needs to teach the reader. It needs to teach the reader something new about the story that they didn't know before they saw that panel. It has to prepare the reader for what they're going to see next, get them ready to see and understand the next panel. And it needs to remind the reader of something they've seen before so that they understand how that panel exists in the story. Now, I know Lorraine has had the pleasure of visiting my office several years ago, and I think they've seen some of my comic book work, so they know what an amazing drawer and illustrator I am. But for those of you who don't know, I will just let you know that maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, I got my Master in Fine Arts degree. And the reason why I'm saying that is you're about to see some of the most amazing, best comic book drawings you have ever seen produced by me for purposes of this discussion today. So, Leroy, and I assume you're laughing out loud at that, and maybe some other folks are as well. But here we have a really simple three-panel comic. And for people who like to read comics, this probably makes sense. We've got a baseball player getting ready to swing at a pitch. The baseball goes flying through the air, and then some kid catches that baseball. And because we're seeing these three images in order, our mind starts to put that story together. But something that a lot of really talented comic makers forget is that most of their readers are not comic makers themselves. And what starts to happen is, and I see this every day when I'm reading comics myself, when I'm working with my students, when I'm talking to friends about comics they're reading. When you are a talented maker of comics, that means you are also a talented reader of comics, which means you are able to see and understand things about comics that the average reader just wouldn't see or understand. And so I think if I show you here a slightly different version of this same story, you'll start to see what I'm talking about. So here's a slightly different version of that same story. It's the same beats, right? We get the baseball player, we get the baseball, we get the kid. But I want you to notice a couple of differences. So in the first panel, we actually see the swing of the baseball and we see the baseball leaving the panel. So what this panel is teaching us is that a baseball player just hit a baseball. And what it's preparing us for is to see that baseball flying through the air in the next panel. Then in that panel is reminding us that we are at the baseball game by showing the baseball diamond in the corner. It's teaching us that that ball is going really high up in the air in a way the original version doesn't. And it's preparing us to understand that we are at a large baseball stadium where there's a big crowd. Then in the final version, it's still that kid catching that ball, but there's a couple of small little details. First of all, you'll notice that what he's saying is different. Instead of just screaming yes and celebrating like he might in real life, he's yelling, "I caught the ball," teaching the reader that that's what happened. We're being reminded that that ball is in motion, and we're being reminded that there is a crowd at the baseball game. And so what I'm trying to express here is that this is basically the same story. And if you were to look at the first version of this, it would make sense and you might understand what it's trying to say. But I believe panels have responsibilities other than just showing the next part of the story, that they have responsibilities to try to teach and help the reader see and understand what's happening. And so, even though these are both very simple comics that most of you could probably do a much better job of drawing, what I'm trying to express here is the details in the artwork in the second version. While there's more to look at, the story is easier to see because each panel is teaching us something new, preparing us to see something we'll see in the future, and reminding us of something that we've already seen in the past. And so this is a really important concept in comic storytelling in my mind and in my own work. But a comic that I feel does a really wonderful job of this is a comic called Jonah and the Impossible Monsters. This is a comic by artists and writers Chris Samney and Laura Samney. And I believe it's colored by an artist named Matthew Wilson. I think this comic came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's recently been collected in a beautiful trade paperback where you can get the whole story. But I'd like to show you a couple of pages to kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So these are I believe, the second and third pages of the first chapter of this comic. And there are some subtle things happening here that go into that prepare, teach, and remind like mode that, again, to like an astute comic reader, you might not notice, but I'd love to kind of like spend a little time talking about them. So on the first page, we see this beautiful wide shot, sort of like a lush sort of jungle area with some plants. but we hear a person speaking. So we're being taught that we're in the jungle, but we're being prepared to see a person. Then in the next panel, we see that person. So we're reminded of the voice we heard before. The new thing we're learning is what that character looks like, but then we're being taught that they're looking for someone. So that in the next panel, when we hear a noise in the background, we can assume it's the person that they're looking for. Then on the next page, you can see here, we get a close-up of the feet so that we're learning that whoever we're looking at here is wearing these brown sandals, so that in the very next panel, even though we're really zoomed out and there's not a ton of detail, we know that it's that character because we see those same brown sandals. This happens again in a later page here. You can see this this character Jonah. They're running through the trees. They're just kind of having fun out in the jungle. But then we see this like new sort of red plant. We're taught that there are these new red plants. But then in the next couple panels, when the large monster, which we'll meet in a moment, is sort of starting to like rummage through the jungle, that plant's color changes in a way to teach us that those plants represent this kind of strange and monstrous danger. And then eventually here you can see we have mostly green and like bluish hues. These orange and red hues come to represent the monsters moving through the jungle, so that on the next page, when we finally meet one, we are able to learn and understand that that monster is like something separate from the jungle. Now, I understand that for those of you who are very talented illustrators and very smart thinkers about comics, like this already makes a ton of sense, and it's not something that like hasn't occurred to you before. But to always ground yourself in the perspective of the reader and say, well, what does the reader need on this page to understand that that monster is separate from the jungle? I should probably teach them that on the previous page. And so the way that that works here is all of the shots that have to do with the monster have this cool red stuff going on, so that then when we get to the next page, we're just primed and ready to go in terms of our understanding. There's a couple other pages here, some great action sequences. And here, you know, we're taught the distance here, so that here we're learning and seeing and understanding the scale of the monster here. Then a little bit later in the story, there are these slightly quieter scenes, a little bit less action. But I'd love to talk maybe about the first couple panels on the left-hand side page here. So you can see there's these two characters interacting with one another. One of the characters has this hat, and there's like a little feather in the hat, and one of the characters notices it. But there's like a couple really cool subtle storytelling things that happen here. So you can see here on the fourth panel on the left-hand page, we are getting a very detailed, very close-up drawing of that character's face. If you look throughout the rest of the pages here, most of these faces are drawn in a very cartoony, very minimal style. But on this panel, we're getting a very detailed expression. That's teaching us that this character's emotions are very, very important. Different than some of these earlier pages where it's all about physical activity, running through the jungle, right? Like it's that sensation of following these characters through the world. Here, where we get a slightly more realistic drawing, it says, hey, this character's emotions are what matter. And that is teaching us that the emotions matter, and it's preparing us to pay attention to that character's emotions, which gets paid off in the very next panel, where we start to see that this character sort of is looking longingly or lovingly at the character with the hat. But then at the same time, just a couple panels later, at the bottom of the page, you can see the character with the hat is hungry. But them holding their bag with a little sound effect, that doesn't teach us they're hungry. What prepares us to see that, though, are these strong aromas of the food in the marketplace kind of wafting through the panel. And so in this panel, this drawing of that food and that aroma is not super important, but it prepares us to understand what we're about to learn on the very next panel. And these are really small details that don't make a huge difference in terms of the plot, but make a ton of difference in terms of helping the reader track that story. By putting things and drawing things in certain ways in panels to prepare us to understand what is important is really, really crucial. And so I don't want to spoil too much. This is a wonderful comic. It's a kind of an all ages action adventure story. If you're fans of, I don't know, maybe movies like The Never Ending Story, if anyone here's seen that, or any of those great like 80s adventure movies, this might be something that you're interested in. Also, too, if you're a fan of like kaiju and monster movies, this might be a comic worth checking out. Okay, so then the next thing I wanted to talk about was another really important aspect of comic making is something that I am talking to my students about all the time, which is oftentimes you want to draw what is clear, not what is real. And this is very, very hard for lots of comic artists to do because most comic artists are very talented illustrators who are coming from a background of arts and art education that really values being able to draw things the way that they look, right? If you think about painters you like, or drawers you like, or illustrators you like, a lot of the times we say to ourselves, oh, that person's a good painter because they can paint something that looks like what it is. And there are certain art forms where that's really important and valuable, and there are certain times where maybe that's a good skill to have with your comics. However, I think more often than not, it's much better to draw something that is not real, but is clear. So to kind of talk about what I mean by that, I actually want to pivot to movies a little bit. So here's a shot from a movie called Back to the Future, a pretty famous movie in the United States. I assume some of you have probably seen. It's about a time traveling teenager. But what I want you to notice is, can you see how the mall parking lot is wet here, right, on the ground? Like you can see there's all kinds of reflections and lights and texture on the ground. Here's another shot from a different movie. This is from a movie called Terminator, a science fiction action adventure movie from the 80s. You can see here, there's no rain. The buildings are dry as a bone, but the ground is wet. And then here's another shot. I think this is from the most recent Matrix movie. And you see the exact same thing. It's not raining. There's no weather, but the ground is wet. Once you notice this in movies, it's very hard to unsee, but very often when there are exterior scenes in movies that are shot at night, they purposely make the ground wet to make the image clearer. Because if the ground is wet, then the figures and the vehicles and the buildings that are on top of that ground stand out above those reflections. Those forms look much more solid and heavy, as opposed to if this was just flat black ground, it might be hard to tell where objects are beginning and ending and where the ground is beginning and ending. And so this is an example in movie making of photographing something that is not real, but clear. It's very hard to have wet ground with no rain. It's not realistic at all, but it makes the image clearer. And so that's an example of how this works in movies. But where you see this happening a lot in comics, I think, is on comic book covers. So I'm going to show you here two of my favorite comic book covers. The one on the left is from a comic called Tales from the Crypt of Terror. You can see this hilarious image of like a haunted 3D comic book, like reaching for that character. And then on the right, you can see a comic from DC Comics called The Witching Hour, where there's this like evil Santa Claus kind of hidden behind this curtain. These images are both very, very clear. If you look at these images, the one on the left, it's obvious what is happening. This person reading this comic is terrified because these hands are reaching out from the comic. And if you look at the one on the right, this is a very scary, almost like a horror movie kind of image where this kid is about to meet this very like evil, scary Santa Claus. But if you look at these images and the way that they're drawn, they actually make no sense at all. So for example, if you look at the way the character is holding the comic book, they're actually the character that's getting scared is holding the comic like up and away from themselves, right? Those hands aren't even coming towards them. Plus, I don't wear 3D glasses all the time, but it's almost impossible to move your head back so quickly that your 3D glasses stay in space, right? And then, of course, to say nothing of the fact that these two characters at the table are like sitting next to each other in space, but they're kind of like looking at each other while they're next to each other in a way that's not natural. And then if you look at the cover with the Santa Claus image, you can see in the way that it's inked and the way that it's colored, we understand that Santa is hiding behind this curtain in a very dark room, but it's drawn in a way where there's like a giant spotlight hitting Santa from the front. If this were like a real image, there would be a huge light shooting light out into that classroom, and the kids would be able to see everything right behind the curtain. But because the drawing is clear, we don't care that it's not real. I think another famous example of this is obviously Action Comics #1. It's a great cover. It really sort of displays a lot of action and activity, but there's a lot of stuff here that really doesn't make any sense at all. You'll notice like the way the windows are breaking, the way the car is crumpling, the way the back of the car is in perspective, but the front is not. That guy in the front corner, like, is he running away or is he standing like with his holding his head? It's not a realistic image, but it's a clear image and a powerful one. And the reason why I bring this up is I find a lot of times when I'm working with students, what they are very, very focused on is drawing correct perspective, drawing realistic choreography, drawing things that make sense in a way that would work if they were making a movie or a video game or a television show. But comics require very different rules in terms of how we show the audience something that's clear. And I think more often than not, the way you do that is by not drawing what is real, but what is clear. And so a comic that I think does a really great job of this is a comic called The Shark King by a Hawaiian American artist named R. Kiku Johnson. For those who aren't familiar with Johnson's work, they do lots of illustration and editorial illustration for newspapers and magazines. I think they're thought of more as an illustrator than a comic artist. But this is a wonderful young reader comic that they did maybe about 15 years ago, I think. And it's the sort of like a retelling of an indigenous Hawaiian myth of this character, the Shark King. So I want to show you a couple spreads from this comic. So this is early on in the comic where a woman encounters this character, the Shark King. Spoiler for a 1,000-year-old legend, but the Shark King can become a shark or a human. She's out on the beach picking these snails called opihi. When there's a giant wave, the shark comes in, but then as she falls into the water, the Shark King transforms into a human and pulls her out. And if you look at these comics, they're very, very clear. The images are very well drawn and easy to see, but it's filled with weird perspectives that just don't seem to make any sense. So, for example, here, you can see this shot here. The way she's running is like totally unrealistic and cartoony. Like she kind of looks like I don't know, like a crossing sign, but it makes it clear that she's in danger and running. Also, too, the idea here that that wave would be tall enough for the shark to be suspended in space while still in the wave, that kind of doesn't make sense logistically from a perspective kind of point of view. You can see here the way in the third panel, the Shark King is like standing on the rocks, reaching out in front of himself, but somehow also pulling the character out of the water below him. And I want to be very clear, I'm not down on these drawings. I think these are the perfect, most beautiful drawings for the way this story needs to be told. I'm just kind of trying to highlight the idea that these drawings are not realistic and they are making choices about framing and layout and composition that help clarity. Here is another example here. The Shark King decides to return to the water, so he jumps off this cliff. One small thing you see in lots of comic storytelling is on this last panel on the left-hand page. If he was jumping off that cliff, there isn't really a time where his body would be going out at that straight an angle, at that shallow an angle. It would be much, much steeper if he were falling. And then a shot that you see in lots of comics is this kind of like over the water, under the water shot. And if you've ever seen a movie or a photo shot that way, there's tons of weird lens distortion that happens. But here we're getting a perfectly consistent shark silhouette. And it's just the kind of the cool thing that you can really only do in a drawing and in comics and in telling a story that way. Here's another great example. Later on in the book, we do meet the Shark King, his son that he has with the woman that he met on the beach. This shot here borrows a lot from comics like Astro Boy, if anyone's ever read any of those. This is a beautiful drawing, wonderful colors, but it's totally unrealistic, right? We wouldn't see the splash, hear the splash, and see the kid coming at us in front of the camera. There isn't really like a world where a bunch of these fish are being sunlit from in front, but then a bunch of the fish are in dark silhouette because they're lit from the back. Also, too, we are below the water line, but when we look up, we see those rocks and those mountains kind of at like an eye level perspective. This drawing is awesome. And I think anyone listening today or seeing this in the future would be totally stoked if they ended up making a drawing this good. Again, what I'm trying to highlight though is there are storytelling decisions being made that are driving the artwork as opposed to the other way around. And then another one of my favorite examples here, eventually there's a point in the story where the Shark King like starts stealing fish from these fishermen, right? And this sequence here is, I think, a perfect example of something that is clear but not realistic. Like the way that all these fish are kind of on one plane in that first panel, and the character, their name is Nanawe, just kind of swimming right towards them. And then here you can even see in the difference between the first panel and third panel, then Nawe's path totally changes, right? Here they're going down and up, whereas here they're kind of going out and around the fishnet. And so the logic of that movement isn't even consistent across these three panels, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't affect our ability to see the story, and it actually makes what's happening clearer. That kind of false no point perspective flat shot with then the choreography changing throughout the panels to make each panel clear. I think once you get clued into this idea in your comic making, you'll really kind of start to understand why certain sequences that might look good as drawings don't quite work well enough as comic storytelling. And then there's a wonderful sequence in the book as well, where Nanawe's appetite really starts to like take over, and they're eating just all these incredible amounts of fish, getting larger and larger. And there's kind of two things happening here. One is this super artificial page layout, right? Like just like most of the other pages in this comic are pretty traditional, just kind of rectangles or trapezoids on a grid. But here you get this really cool kind of like visual stacking that sort of helps to show the escalation of the size of these animals. And then one of my favorite drawings of the book here at the very bottom, you've got the Naue with this huge stomach because he's eaten so many fish, right? And it's just like that's not really how a kid's body would work under these circumstances. But it is clear when we look at these images and when we look at this page, we understand what's happening in the story, which I think is almost always way more important than doing just a realistic drawing. Okay, so then the last thing I want to kind of talk about is something that I see lots of students that I work with kind of struggle with, which is that difference between style and clarity. So to talk about this, I want to talk about maybe a slightly more obscure comic than those first two. I want to talk about one specific issue of a comic called The Amazing World of Gumball. So this comic is based on a cartoon show that maybe some of you are familiar with called The Amazing World of Gumball. And this comic features two short stories. The first one is by artists Tyson Messi and Paulina Garshanow, and then the second one is by Michael Amon. These stories feature the same characters, they feature the same worlds, the same setups, but because they are drawn in two very different styles, they have two very different feels and emotional tones. So I want to show you here on the left, we're seeing a page from the first story, and on the right, we're seeing a page from the second story. And you can see the setup is almost exactly the same. A character is waking up in their bunk bed, but the emotional tone of the artwork is very, very different because of the style of the artwork. On the left, we have a much flatter, much more clean line, less expressive style. On the right, we have a much busier, heavier, more inky, more dynamic version of that story. If we go here, you can see too, like the emotional tones start swinging. You can see that we're getting like much more like medium shots with like medium emotional tones in the first story, but then big swings in terms of camera distance and focal length and abstraction in the second story. What you'll also notice too is that the lettering is significantly different. You'll notice in the first story, the lettering is very, very consistent. It's almost always placed at the top of the panel. It's always the same size, and it's lettered in a way where the first person speaking is almost always on the left-hand side of the panel. Whereas in the second story, the lettering is swinging a lot in terms of its weight and its size and its placement. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is style versus clarity is if we go through a few more pages, here are examples from that first story. Here's an example from that second story. You can see that big shift in style. I would say that the first comic is much clearer to see and understand than the second comic. But the second comic is much more emotionally expressive and is drawn in a way that matches the tone of the story. And I think that for me, it's not that you always want to have your comics be perfectly clear, but you want to make sure if they aren't clear, is there some kind of trade-off there? And so I think what kind of happens is eventually in the later story, you can see here, because of that big, flowy, dynamic style, we get tons of really fun action and choreography, and the very hectic nature and kind of the chaos of some of these scenes comes through really, really clear in a way that I think is like not quite possible in that first story, excuse me, which is like a much more sort of gridded, matter of fact, clean kind of presentation. And you know, if we compare like this scene here in the clearer quote unquote story, they take 2 pages to get the characters into a new scene and location. Whereas in the second story, it's a much faster, more dynamic pace, and they take maybe like a quarter of the page to kind of do the same thing, moving those characters around. And so my point kind of being is that yes, it's important that your comics be clear. Yes, it's important that your comics are constructed in a way where you're teaching the reader, preparing the reader, and reminding the reader of what they've seen before. But you don't want to do that at the expense of, does this comic look like the type of story I'm trying to tell? And I think you can see here on both of these pages, again, from the 2 separate stories, they feature very similar moments where in the bottom panels of both pages, these characters are having these big emotive like revelations. But I think on the first story, it actually comes across as like a humorous kind of undercut that they're like not as excited as they should be. Whereas in the second story, those big emotions are just visible on the page right away. And so I think that what I see when I'm working with lots of students and comic makers is their instincts are in the right place in terms of clarity based on some of those principles that I've talked about before. But sometimes they kind of lose they lose the forest for the trees to a certain extent, in the sense that like you can have a story that sometimes is a little less clear and asks the reader to do a little bit more if the emotional payoff is there in the artwork. And so the reason why I like to show these 3 comics is I think that they kind of, in really simple, direct, all ages, young reader style material, make really clear some of those principles that I think are super important for comic readers, that makers of comics would be good to kind of revisit and think about. And so just to kind of sum up, it's that trilogy of teach, prepare, remind. If each panel can do those 3 things, chances are you've got the right image for that panel. Also, 2, remember to draw what is clear, not what is real. Yes, good illustrations are great to have in your comics. Sometimes a better drawing is going to make your comic better, but I find more often than not, a clear drawing that is not realistic is going to be better for your comic than a realistic drawing that is hard to see or unclear. And then, of course, always making sure you're thinking about that balance between like style and clarity. When do you let the artwork lead in terms of expressing the emotions of the story versus when do you let the clarity of storytelling lead in terms of like delivering that plot information? And so to my mind, these 3 comics, Jonah and the Impossible Monsters, Shark King, and Gumball #8, kind of cover a ton of territory inside of what are really small, simple, short, quick, succinct, but wonderful comics that I think any reader can kind of wrap their head around without having to be like really deep into any specific style of drawing or genre or artwork. So I think that's where I'd kind of maybe like to end my comments. Leorian, I don't know if there's any part of that that you'd like me to go a little bit deeper on. I also see there was some stuff in the chat, if there's any questions I could answer, or if I can return to any of these specific examples, I'd be happy to do so.
Yeah, don't worry. Let's start our Q&A now. First of all, amazing, as always, Robert. I think that especially the part that talking about comics with comics that you recommend, and that part that I always struggle with my students also, the youth library, that you have to first of all tell a story. These are comic books, and most of the comic books, and even when they're starting, they're trying to talk about like fantasy. So, what do you want it to make like realism? Yeah, we have like the I always told them about the rule of cool. Like if it's cool and it like you understand and give the message away, yeah, you done it. And it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be like perfect like composition or the like even what only the only I think the street rule is that leave space for text because sometimes you concentrate on how amazing they will look and a speech bubble the ultimate like block it out. That's something about uh, but all on that I totally agree with you, and I think we're having like a master class about comic creating thanks to you. So chicos, pueden poner sus preguntas tanto en el chat como en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, que es el cuadrito que está ahí. ¿Ven? Pueden aprovecharlas nuevamente en español o en inglés, no importa. Preguntas sobre cómics, preguntas sobre lo que hemos visto, si quieren que repita alguna parte también. Y recuerden que también Robert es profesor en el MCAD, que es el Instituto de Arte y Diseño de Minneapolis. Si quieren preguntar algo sobre las clases de cómic, cómo son o las oportunidades que tengan allá, también esta es la oportunidad para hacerlo. Entonces, vamos a empezar. Let's start the Q&A, Robert. Let's go with Karen. What if I have a semi-realistic style? How can I create visually interesting environments without running the style? I struggle a lot with this.
Yeah, so I think Karen, thanks for the question, and it's always a challenge when you feel like maybe the way you draw naturally or your style kind of gets in the way of your comic storytelling. I would maybe say I would say maybe three things, and so one is I mean, maybe this is good news. I would encourage you to actually watch a lot of television and movies, especially television shows that have lots of characters like speaking and interacting with one another. The reason being, even though television and film can do things that comics can't, most television shows have to deal with realistic images that are photographed. And if you pay close attention to not like the story and not how like handsome or beautiful all the actors and actresses are, but if you focus on how is this director putting these characters in the scene and where is this director putting the camera to present a realistic image that can be quickly understood, I think there could be a lot of dividend there. So I would encourage you to, if you aren't already, expanding your like inspirations beyond just like still images and illustrations and looking at some movie stuff. What I would also encourage you to think about is, and this has helped some students that I've worked with before, is if you think of your comic panels as like a diorama that you're looking through, and if your style is like very realistic, and you start trying to figure out like surface perspective or foreshortening or lens distortion and stuff like that. If you think about your comic panels as a diorama, and only give yourself three levels. There's only foreground, midground, and background. And those areas are clearly separate from one another. So, like, just as an example, something that happens a lot is, there'll be a scene of characters sitting around talking around a table. And artists who I work with who are very good at drawing realistic stuff, they want to come up with a cool camera angle that lets them draw that whole scene in perspective, where we've got like the backs of people's heads looking over their shoulders onto the table, people on the table, and then people behind them. And then that scene just becomes way too busy and hard to see. And the difference between foreground and background is really hard to tell. And so if you really just give yourself like, hey, there's just three levels. There's what's in front, what's in the middle, and what's behind. Don't worry about what the space would actually look like. just kind of sketch out and draw that like more diagrammatic version. Um, and then the other thing too is, and I don't have any slides of their artwork in my presentation tonight, but there is a wonderful American comic, or sorry, not American, I think they're English rather, an English comic artist named Sean Phillips. They're probably most famous for a book called Criminal, but they've done a bunch of other high profile comics for American publishers. They have, to my mind, what is a very realistic style, but what they do really well is add tons of shadow to their figures and their backgrounds so that they start to create these really cool shape relationships where stuff is like standing out from other objects. And so just going back to that, like that realism thing, if for you, the way that you draw, you're just always going to draw stuff in realistic proportions, realistic camera distances with realistic perspective and environments. I think what you could think about is what is unrealistic in your style is the way you handle lighting and shadow, so that that gives you a little bit more control over where things are kind of appearing and disappearing in the panels.
So just quickly, let me like try to resume that in Spanish so the whole audience can enjoy that great explanation. En cuanto, chicos, Robert lo que recomienda es que si tú tienes un estilo semi-realista o realista, como mencionó Karen, concéntrense en buscar referencias de cine. Bien, vean películas, vean como en las películas, que ¿verdad? Son actores reales, ven, ellos juegan con planos, juegan con la cámara para contar una historia, porque recuerden que lo más importante en los cómics es contar la historia. Y un truco que a él le funciona es siempre imaginártelo como una maqueta, todos tus mundos, tus cómics, tus páginas, con tres planos. El primer plano, lo que está adelante, el segundo plano, lo que está en el medio, y el tercer plano, lo que está atrás. Bien, entonces, lo que está adelante, lo que está en el medio y lo que está atrás. Entonces, tú te imaginas eso, incluso puedes bocetar y puedes hacer un pequeño mapita. Eso lo usan mucho en cómics largos, por ejemplo, donde hay un sitio que se repite en una locación, como una habitación, una base, di mira, la televisión está adelante, luego de este lado hay una cama, luego aquí está esto, o sea, para ellos mismos guiar al lector moviendo la cámara y saber que, mira, del lado derecho está la cama, pero del lado izquierdo hay una ventana, que a veces se cometen esos errores, que tú moviendo la cámara se te olvida que había una ventana o algo, pero en resumen eso, en resumen, si quieres, si tu estilo es realista o semi-realista y quiere que se entienda y quiere que se vea dinámico, pues ve cine, ve cómo los directores utilizan los planos, los movimientos con los actores para hacerlo dinámico y céntrate en primer plano, lo que está delante, segundo plano, lo que está en el medio y tercer plano. Um, Karen is thanking you in the chat because she always get like she said that her style she didn't like feel it like any cartoony, so she didn't got like good angles and dynamic poses. And but don't worry, but no te preocupes, Karen. O sea, la idea es eso, trabaja con lo que tú tienes, no tienes que romper tu estilo si no es necesario, solamente usa las referencias. Recuerden, chicos, pueden ponerlo en el chat las preguntas o en la cajita de preguntas y respuestas que está ahí en las opciones. So, Brit asks, which are the top pillars at the time of decide to play with both clear and stylized panel? Any books or content to develop such direction guide for guide for it more on the learning area?
So I'm going to go back to the slide that I have with some textbooks. If I'm kind of understanding this correctly, Britt, it sounds like what you're sort of asking is when you're making your comics, when do you decide to push things to be more dynamic versus when do you tell the story more naturalistically? And maybe what are some resources to kind of handle that? I want to mention maybe a section of maybe two of these books that I think you might enjoy. Then I want to mention another book by an author who's on this list, but whose book I did not include. And then maybe I can think of one cartoonist that, to my mind, kind of I think does what you're talking about. So this book here, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. I understand that this book has a somewhat challenging reputation because, as you could imagine, it's Stan Lee kind of being a blowhard about how great Marvel Comics are. However, there is a section in this book where they do talk through this exact idea of these are the types of panel layouts that are flat and are not dynamic. And then these are the ways you can get a panel layout that is more dynamic and more evocative. Now, in this book, because they're talking about superhero comics, they basically say all of your panels should be as dynamic as possible. I disagree with that. I think that what you want to be thinking about is when you're designing your pages and when you're thinking about your drawings, you should always start with a simple flat image. But then as you're planning, you should double check and say, hey, does this moment in the story need something more emotional? And if it does, that's when you go to the dynamic stuff. Because if all of your panels are dynamic all the time, none of them feel special or different, and the reader won't be able to tell when you're being dynamic for a storytelling reason versus when you are just kind of showing off. But in this book, the techniques that they describe in terms of how to make a panel more dynamic, I think is very, very useful. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. So this book here, Drawing Words and Writing Pictures by Jessica Abel and Matt Madden, I think of the books that I've listed here on this textbook slide, I think this is the one that does the best job in terms of really integrating your artwork and your style into like the emotions and tones of your story. I think that this book is probably a little bit more like foundational than maybe the question you're asking, but this might be a good book to look at. But one thing I really want to recommend is a book. One of the co-authors here, Matt Madden, they released a comic. I believe it's called 99 Stories. I may Google on the side really quick what that title is. But what that comic does is it takes the same one-page comic story, but then redraws it 99 times with different styles, different panel layouts, and different like structures and stuff like that. And it's like a weird kind of cool experiment. So it's not quite like a textbook, but I think if you were to be able to get your hands on a copy of that or find it online, reading through that book will show you like the effect that those dynamic panels can have. And that might start to clue you into like, oh, I'm working on a story and I wish it felt like this version of Matt Madden's story. You can then kind of start to graft some of those ideas onto your artwork. And then in terms of a specific comic artist who I think is very good at kind of managing those like those swings in terms of like dynamic to non-dynamic, that would probably be a Scottish artist named Frank Quitely, who I think is maybe most famous for, they did a great Superman comic a few years ago called All-Star Superman. They've also drawn a ton of X-Men, but they have a comic that I love called We Three, which is about these like three cute animals who end up becoming like machines in a military adventure, and they're trying to escape and earn their freedom and stuff like that. And the artwork in that book does these really big swings. Like some of the panels are very, very flat, just focused on story, but then other panels, the way he draws it, just incredible big perspective backgrounds. I also see in the chat, Barbara's doing a wonderful job of like keeping up and mentioning the books and things that I'm mentioning. I think that the trick here is to not think about how do I make every panel as dynamic as possible. The trick is to say, what are the moments in my story where I want big, visible, dynamic emotions? And then here's the best part. If you think that way, it actually saves you a ton of work as the comic maker, because you don't have to do the labor of making every panel as dynamic as possible. By actually drawing less and drawing more simply in some areas, and then saving those dynamic moments for those important story moments, you'll actually be able to get your comics done faster and at a higher level of quality, because you won't be like chasing this crazy dynamic panel layout all the time.
Well, let me just quickly again try to summarize that in Spanish. So, Robert lo que está diciendo que principalmente recomendó las obras que están en el chat, Bien, las cuales son primero la How to Draw Comic de Marvel Way de Stan Lee y John Buscema, especialmente la parte que habla de cómo hacer tus paneles dinámicos. Y también that one. And also okay. Drawing Words and Writing Pictures, con Jessica Abel y Matt Madden. Pero en especial el hecho de que y Robert considera que es importante un balance en una historia. O sea, en el libro de Marvel decían hacer el Marvel Way, que era todo dinámico, todo con acción, porque eran historias de superhéroes, pero en una historia no necesariamente todo tiene que ser dinámico. Hay momentos tranquilos, hay momentos de acción. Entonces tú tienes que elegir como autor, como dibujante, cuándo dibujar de manera dinámica y cuándo dibujar de manera serena y hasta un poquito plana, porque es, cuando tú tomas esa decisión, incluso narrativamente se ve mejor y trabajas más rápido y se ve más profesional el trabajo que simplemente querer que todo sea súper dinámico y súper movido, que es un balance visual y de ritmo también a la historia. Por cierto, estamos tomando nota de todas las obras, Bárbara está dejándolas en el chat y la vamos a compartir por los grupos también, las recomendaciones de Robert. Entonces, últimas preguntas, chicos. Déjame ver. Ok, está bien, Karen. Estamos aquí todos los viernes, ya tú sabes. Gracias por tu pregunta y por estar por aquí. Nos vemos el próximo viernes a las 9. A ver. Okay, Bridge says that thank you for your reply. It was really helpful. I'll try to keep it in mind and also suggest your recommendations. I'll have an eye and Frank quietly work for this recording. Yes, lo vamos a compartir en la lista, no se preocupen. So, Gary PS asked, can you give us some tricks about making a good pacing?
Yeah, so Gary, that's a big question, and it's sometimes hard to answer because it really depends on the story you're trying to tell. And so when you're saying like good pacing, I think we all kind of understand what you're talking about, which is like the story feels like it's being told at a speed that makes sense. But you could imagine different stories requiring different pacings. When I talk to students that I've worked with about this, I'm going to kind of click ahead here. It's these three things. My feeling is if you're telling your story at a pace where you can do that teach, prepare, and remind thing within your panels in a way that's effective, that's probably a sign that your pacing is correct. But if your pacing is too fast and you feel like the panels and the drawings are too busy to do all of these three things, that might be a sign that you need to slow it down a little bit. Maybe you decompress, you use more panels to cover less time so that each panel has an opportunity to do these things. Or maybe the opposite is true. And if what you're noticing is that there's nothing to remind the reader of, right? Or there's nothing that you have to get the reader ready to understand, that might be a sign that your pacing is too slow. And you might want to start speeding things up a little bit. I think a lot of times, and I don't know if this is exactly why you're asking, Gary, but when I talk to students about pacing, what I kind of have noticed is that they are treating their comics the way you might treat a storyboard for film or television, in the sense that they want every panel to feel like it's occupying the same amount of time and all of like the choreography in the scene is happening panel to panel. But another thing to keep in mind is that the wonderful thing about comics, and I'm going to scan through here, there's probably some examples in some of the panels I was showing earlier. Like, for example, if you look at, this is panel 6 on the left-hand page, there are like 3 or 4 things happening in that image, right? If that was a television or movie shot, the director would hate it because there's too much to look at. We're looking through too many things. It's hard to see, but we get to see the character in love in the background, the hungry character in the midground, the like kind of like depressed citizens of this destroyed town in the foreground, and then that food and stuff like that. All of which is to say, sometimes the question of pacing is how many panels are you using, right? And again, if you feel like it's too hard to teach, prepare, and remind, maybe you slow down. If you feel like there's not enough there to teach and remind about, you speed up. But another way to think about pacing is not the number of panels, but the amount of things happening in that panel. And the really cool thing about comics is, because we're looking at still images, you can actually show a lot more happening in one image of a comic than you could in an image in a movie or a television show or maybe even a video game, because it's a still thing that we can kind of look at and explore, as opposed to a moving image where we kind of have to see, 60 of them a second. So I would say maybe keep those ideas in mind. Think about how much stuff you're putting into one panel. And if you want to speed things up or slow things down, you can put like less or more in each panel. And then also pay attention to if you feel like teaching, preparing, and reminding is easy to do in your images. And if it's not, you can decide, is it because you're moving too fast or too slow?
Bien, nuevamente resumiendo, Robert, la pregunta de Gary sobre el pacing, ¿verdad? Sobre el storytelling visual de viñeta a viñeta. Él recomienda esto de teach, prepare and remember, de enseña, prepara y recuerda, que es primero la enseñar, mostrar, luego preparar, ¿verdad? Poner algo que viene y luego recordar al lector de eso que mostró. Entonces, algo que funciona mucho también es la cantidad de cosas que puedas poner en las viñetas, ¿verdad? En los paneles. Recordar, tener en cuenta que esto es un medio visual, pero estático. No es una película que si se mueve mucho la cámara, la gente se marea. En un cómic tienes la ventaja de que tú puedes mostrar y la gente, como es fijo una imagen, puede verla, revisarlo de nuevo. Puede ver y puede detenerse a ver detallitos que estaban en el fondo y eso ayuda a la relectura también del material. Esa recomendación viene de que tú mismo tienes que saber si tu cómic te permite ese ritmo de si estás enseñando mucho, entonces prepara menos, o si ya enseñaste un poquito, pues prepara más, entonces ahí está cómo lograr ese ritmo. Así que, Gary, espero que ellos haya respondido a tu pregunta. Okay, Gary said that thank you so much. So, guys, I think that was the last question for dear old Robert. So let me see, let me see. Good pacing. Yeah, yeah. I think that's all. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think that's all. So, una vez más, agradecidos a todos por estar aquí en esta Maco Expo 2026. Gracias a nuestros patrocinadores de IREX y de Wildlife, Young Leader of the American Initiative. Obviamente a Moro Studio, la Maco Expo, y a Robert Algeo por estar aquí con nosotros desde MCAD. Así que le daremos un fuerte aplauso digital. Y recordando que el próximo viernes seguimos en el mismo link, en las mismas clases, para que puedan estar y seguir aprovechando lo que trae la Maco Expo 2026, que la próxima semana tendremos a la estimada Bárbara Márquez, hablando un poquito de escritura para cómics. So, Robert, I just was wrapping up. Thank you again for being with us. I know Minneapolis has been interesting lately, to not say another word, yeah, to say something. So it means a lot to us here. Have a second home here in the Caribbean. Wherever you wish to come, we will greet you. Not with a piña colada, that's tourist stuff. We're gonna give you the real good stuff. So don't worry, you have to come here.
Well, I mean, hey, Lear, warm weather and sunshine is all I would need. So, I mean, I thank you for acknowledging what's going on in town. But this was a highlight of my week. Looking forward to speaking with all of you, and I really appreciate just being able to be present and sharing ideas with a bunch of like-minded comic makers. So, Lear, please tell your colleagues, don't hesitate to reach out to me if they have questions in the future. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and are able to make some good comics sometime soon.
Robert le agradece por estar aquí, que ustedes no sé si han visto la noticia, pero Minneapolis no está muy caliente ahora mismo, parece eso por alrededor del agua, pero estar con nosotros y hablar sobre cómics ha sido su mejor momento de la semana, así que agradece mucho y que no duden en contactarlo, en buscar Robert, are we allowed to share your email with the guys?
Yeah, I would definitely, I'd totally be comfortable with that. Just as your colleagues know, I unfortunately don't know how to read or speak Spanish. So if you're willing to give me a day or two to run it through Google Translate, no, I would. You can certainly share my email with any of your colleagues who would be interested.
So, ya escucharon, chicos. Robert, voy a dejar el correo de Robert, el correo profesional de Robert, en el chat. Cualquier duda, para
Yeah,
que
you got
tengan
that.
ahí, para que pueden tener un contacto directo con Robert. Aprovechenlo, muchachones, aprovechenlo. Profesor de novelas gráficas en MCAD. Así que aprovechen, tomen nota. Y una vez más, gracias por acompañarnos a la Maco Expo 2026. Seguimos el próximo viernes a la misma hora, la charla de escritura para cómic de Bárbara Márquez. Así que, chicos, muchas gracias. A Robert, a big hug, thank you. Stay safe, stay warm.
Will do.
So,
I'll do my best on all those fronts. Thank you so
yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah. Have a good year, man. I'm so excited and looking forward to being again there. Let's make that happen. I'm looking forward, looking how to make it happen, but maybe not right now.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
but, but,
Give it a couple months.
yeah,
Hopefully
yeah,
less than that. But
yeah.
yeah. Whenever you're ready, it would be great to see you again. Of course.
Yes. So, thank you again, and guys, nos vemos. Sayonara, bye bye. Sigan creyendo y creando. Goodbye.